Good evening, students. Welcome to analysis of PGDBA entrance exam uh, that was held today from 12 to 3. Yeah, just a minute. Something is not going quite right here. Let me see. Anyway. So there was no change in the pattern of the exam as such. The exam had total of 50 questions, out of which quantitative aptitude, that is section C, 25 question. That was half of the test was devoted to this one question, one section. Then there were 15 questions on verbal ability and 5 questions on logical reasoning and data interpretation each. Now, in the exam, before the exam began, initially they showed that verbal ability and logical reasoning were combined into one section. Then the section B was on data interpretation, and section C was on quantitative aptitude. However, inside, once you begin the exam, there was no distinction among the sections, and all the questions were appeared. The question palette appeared on the right hand side with no distinction among the sections. And another point was that the overall visual layout of the screen was somewhat cumbersome, to say the least. And this was particularly applicable for verbal ability section that had reading comprehension passage. So you had to scroll down a little bit and to read the entire passage and also read the question that was uh, at the bottom of the screen or bottom of the scroll part. Now, this quantitative aptitude section, that was difficult, and that is the hallmark of this PGDBA test. And other sections where in the verbal ability, it was easy to medium, and the data interpretation and logical reasoning sections were easy. So you could move between the three sections, and the marking scheme was +3, -1. There was no penalty for unattempted questions. And this is a verdict that we have for this year's PGDBA test. So as per the feedback received from the students and as per our analysis, this year's test was slightly more difficult than last year's test. Right? So what we believe is that a score of about 105 should be enough to secure a call for interviews for the general category of students. Now, moving on to the sectional analysis, uh, that is verbal ability and reading comprehension section. So there were two reading comprehension passages uh, having five questions each. And there was one passage on China and Taiwan, and one more passage on agriculture and hunting gathering. And there were 5 questions each on both passages. The first passage on China and Taiwan had mostly direct questions, such as which of the following is true, which of the following is false, and things like that. And that was mainly an easy passage, and also the questions. And the other passage, that is agriculture, hunting and gathering. So that had slightly more inferential questions. Of course, when we compare it to CAT, they were not as challenging as the questions that you see in CAT. So they were more of medium level of difficulty. Then in addition to that, there were two fill in the blanks type questions. Both were vocabulary based and they were easy. And there were three questions on jumbled paragraphs. And one striking feature of this jumbled paragraph questions was that there were four statements this year. So in some of the previous years, there were five statements in the parajumbles. So that made it slightly easier. So what we are looking at is an attempt of 10 to 12 questions in about 30 minutes in this section. Okay. Now, uh, in the PGDBA test, what you should be doing is that you should attempt most of the questions in the other sections. Okay. And whatever number of questions you can attempt in the QA section, that you should attempt, and you should aim at attempting most of the other questions in the other sections. Now moving on to next section, that is logical reasoning. There were five questions in this, and all the five questions were standalone questions. There was no set. And there were questions on arrangement, syllogism, tournaments, and puzzles, and things like that. And all the questions were easy. So we suggest that all the five questions should have been attempted in about 12 to 15 minutes. Now, one striking feature of this PGDBA test is that time is not so much of a constraint. Yeah? So you can devote as much time as you want for these kind of questions, because there are 180 minutes and you have to attempt only 50 questions. So that is what makes it more manageable. Then data interpretation section with five questions. So this was one set of five questions involving simple calculations. Okay. Now, in some of the earlier years, sometimes they used to have one set, sometimes they used to have standalone questions and things like that. So this year, there were five questions in the form of a set. Now, the set was involving a table and a line chart, but the line chart was not really different. It just plotted the same numbers given in a table. Okay? And the level of difficulty was easy because it involved simple calculations. And students should have aimed at attempting all the five questions in about 10 to 15 minutes. Then moving on to quantitative section, 25 questions, which is the half of the test was devoted only to this section. So this is one differentiating factor of PGDBA test, and the questions of higher mathematics at 10+2 level. So which is not present in any of the other tests that you have been taking, such as say CAT, XAT, and things like that. So this year's section was dominated by topics such as say probability, matrices and determinants, higher level algebra. So one notch more difficult and one notch more in-depth than what you have seen in CAT level, and also trigonometry. So they dominated this section. And one striking feature was that questions were more application focused. So it was not like just have one formula and simply apply that formula and get the answer. So they were more application focused. And over the years, we have seen that this test asked questions on conics and calculus, but relatively there were fewer questions on conics and calculus this year. However, another point is that some questions could be smartly solved using options because time was not so much of a constraint in this test. Okay, so students could have used option elimination and attempted some questions using that. Obviously, the overall level of difficulty was indeed a difficult question. It was indeed a difficult section. And what we are looking at is about an attempt of about 16 to 17 questions in about 110 to 120 minutes. So what you should have aimed at doing was that whichever questions were at CAT level of difficulty, you should have attempted all of them. And you should have attempted as many other questions at higher level of difficulty as you possibly could. So this was a topic-wise breakup of the section. So there were 3 questions on functions. All of them were difficult. There were 2 questions on trigonometry. One was easy, one was difficult. 4 questions on higher algebra. So 3 medium, 1 difficult. So some of these 3 medium level or difficulty questions were somewhat similar to CAT level that you have been solving for probably 1 year or more. Then integration, there was only 1 question and it was difficult. Coordinate geometry, 2 questions, both difficult. Limits and continuity, 1 question that was difficult. Permutation combination, 2 questions were medium level of difficulty. Probability, 1 easy and 2 difficult. And matrices and determinants, 2 medium and 1 difficult. Advanced series, that is 2 medium. And set theory, 1 difficult. So overall, out of 25, only 2 questions were easy and 9 questions were at medium level of difficulty and as many as 14 questions were difficult. Okay? So that is what made this section rather a challenging section. Okay? So now what we are looking at is a cutoff of about 105 marks. So in the previous years, it was something like 110 to 115. So because this test was slightly more difficult this year, so we are estimating a cutoff of about 105 this year. And so if you are expecting a score of about 105, 110 types, because that response sheet will be out in 2-3 days time. So you can make an estimate of your score that time. And then in case you are expecting a score of about 110 types, then you can definitely start preparing for interviews. And when it comes to preparation for interviews, you should brush up all the concepts of mathematics at 10+2 level, like say calculus and all of that, uh, advanced series type of questions, matrices and determinants and things like that. So thank you very much and all the best for your interviews. Thank you.